The French movie Cuties has made quite a stir recently for its highly sexualized portrayal of a group of 11-year-old girls. So what kind of movie review are we doing? Well, this is a site focused on cultural collapse and the coming end of the world as we know it, so ponder that for a moment. Yeah. What we're going to do is answer the questions that surround this thing, like, who was it made for? Why do the critics love it when the audience hates it? And just as a bonus, I'm going to explain what this movie has to do with riots that go on for months at a time. But first things first, the people defending this thing insist that it has an empowerment message. What do they mean? Okay. The main character of the movie lives in a traditional Muslim family, but the religion doesn't matter to the overall story arc since it's society that she's straining against, not merely her family's values. No. What matters here is that our main character's will, her desires, her goals, are things that she is expected to lay down as a part of this structure. And that structure is the antagonist, so the villain in the story. You see, France, like all Western nations, has undergone something called Christianization, a telltale shaping of governments, markets, and personal relationships that comes when a percentage of the faithful reaches a high enough level in the country's population. Every Western nation, and now pretty much every nation in the world, has undergone some level of Christianization. And there's all sorts of particulars here in how this alters a country. But the one that concerns us in this movie is the concept of charity, the basic idea that it is somehow better to give than to receive, that real love is synonymous with sacrifice. For example, when couples get married in the West, they make all sorts of vows to each other, saying things like forsaking all others. Statements of laying down one's own personal will for the benefit of another. Remember that this is the bad guy in this story. So what's the good guy? Well, what we've seen over the last 2 centuries is that Christianization in the countries has often transitioned into a society that takes on a belief system called humanism. And it turns out that the first country to really embrace this and even try and form a government around it was France. The movement that crystallized this was called libertine, as in liberating themselves from the constraints of the past. And France may have been the originals, but no one has embraced it quite like Hollywood and the movie-making industry at large. And so we get these sorts of mission statement movies again and again, and we're told how important these movies are. But too many on a particular subject, and it becomes passé. And now, if it's going to be edgy, the next movie has to free us from something even more intrinsic, something even more basic in a set of traditions. So at this point, you might think the movie like this was made for the progressive left, to be embraced and to give fodder for pushing the overall social envelope further towards a zero-tradition way of looking at the world. But I promise you, that's not this movie. I am a writer. I know how story structure works. The story arc of this movie can only be taken one way. And it certainly is not a commentary against the exploitation of girls, as its defenders say. But it's not for it either. No, the structure it takes is the basic good-evil dichotomy of a humanist libertine worldview, which says that good is defined as getting what you want, fulfilling your desires, and evil is defined as the systems of restraint that keep you from these goals. So, in this movie, how do you defeat those systems? You attain power. And here's where our empowerment message comes in, as vile as it is. The power in this case is the girl's sexuality, which our main character learns to use to her advantage to try and compel people to do what she wants them to do, such as a scene where the man whose phone she stole tries to take it back. What can she do to keep the phone? She starts to take her clothes off. Now, again, the movie doesn't condone or really even glamorize this. The guy in that scene stops her. The thing that it is being glamorized is our main character casting off restraint. And there are people out there who would certainly agree with this message. But really, we find out who the movie was made for at the end, when our main character has left her dance group and practically flies away, much like at the end of Birdman. And then it becomes obvious that the person this movie was made for is the director herself. At the time, knowing nothing about her, I thought that she had written this as a kind of vanity project, wherein she, as the creator, was symbolically saving this girl from the social constraints of her Orthodox religious family. But then I looked her up, And like her main character, she comes from an African Muslim background. So, symbolically saving herself, maybe? Now, there's nothing new about vanity projects. And ever since Harry Potter, there's been nothing special about crafting a story wherein the main character is the only character that truly has agency, and everybody else in the story only exists to further or oppose the main character and never seems to have any agendas of their own. But now, in the burgeoning age of narcissism, more and more we find stories like this, where the story arc seems to be nothing more than a vehicle for the writer to live out some sort of power fantasy. And people's response to this movie hinges on whether or not the viewer can take that story and make it about themselves in some meaningful way. Could the audience do this? The answer for 97% is no. Can the critics do this? The answer for 89% is yes. How? Because it allows them to play the role of the white knight, the heroic, supportive ally that makes it possible for some other poor, oppressed soul to find their ultimate freedom. And in the day and age of cancel culture, even corporations sometimes align themselves with these kinds of projects. Don't want to get protested, after all. So, speaking of protests, what does this movie have to do with our modern protest culture? Consider this. The typical mistake of the libertine is twofold. One, the idea that attaining your own desires will bring any sort of lasting satisfaction. In fact, most people find selfishly bending the world and the people in it to their will to be highly dissatisfying activity. No, usually what happens is that the person finds themselves in a kind of circular trap, where they become increasingly depressed and hopeless, and yet, while this is happening, because of their worldview, they blame this unhappiness on their unsatisfied desires. And so they try even harder to bend the world to their whims. The second is even more insidious. The failure to recognize the potential dangers that come with casting off those traditional restraints. In the case of Cuties, we see a total lack of recognition of the consequences of these girls' actions. In the movie, the worst they face is a certain amount of adult disapproval. In real life, we call them predators for a reason. And not just for hundreds of years, but for thousands of years, every marginally advanced society had all sorts of rules to protect their children who don't fully understand sexuality, who can't make informed consent, and who are vulnerable not just because of their level of development, but also because of their innate need to seek adult approval. Opening up children to the sexual marketplace isn't liberating, it's insanity. An 11-year-old girl trying to use sexuality to manipulate the adults around her isn't empowered. She's in very real danger. Now, before I make my last point, how about a little palate cleanser while I regain a little composure? If you don't have mind bleach, at least you have kittens. Okay. Now consider the protests that have gone on for months in places like Portland and Paris. Remember those? These are a direct result of that worldview. Think again of our twofold mistakes. The first, the mistaken idea that gaining your base desires leads to lasting fulfillment. And when a government that is so spineless that it yields to them again and again, does that satisfy the crowd? No, of course not. It leaves them even more unsatisfied. And since they have a worldview that blames that dissatisfaction on the systems around them, all you're doing is creating a spiral where the people you're trying to appease are getting angrier and angrier because you're trying so hard to appease them. That's right, they blame you, even as you bend over backwards to give them what they want. And the second, how do these protesters fail to recognize the dangers of what they're doing? By opposing any sort of societal enforcement? That should be obvious. What they're advocating for doesn't lead to utopia. It leads to the purge. Cuties is a shot across the bow. Really, it's just an overstep for the slow, steady progression that has been leading to the sorts of narcissism and collapse spirals that they create. And that's why a movie like this should be reviewed on a site by a couple of authors who write about the end of the world. This is David Reichert from The Bunker. Hit like and subscribe and click the notification bell, and we'll try and put out at least one video a week. Also, our pandemic horror series, The Holocaust Engine, is available September 14th. Link for pre-order down below.